Sarah Martinez had always known that being one of the few female mechanics on a military base would come with challenges, but she never expected anything like what happened that scorching Tuesday afternoon in July. The sun beat down mercilessly on the airfield at Fort Davidson, where she had been working for 3 years, earning respect through her exceptional skills with aircraft engines and her unwavering dedication to her duties. At 26, Sarah had already proven herself countless times. She could diagnose engine problems that stumped veteran mechanics twice her age, and her innovative solutions had saved the base thousands of dollars in repair costs. Her colleagues had grown to respect her expertise, though some still harbored outdated attitudes about women in traditionally male roles. That particular day started like any other. Sarah arrived at the hangar before dawn, her tool belt secured around her waist and her dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail. She was scheduled to perform routine maintenance on a fleet of transport helicopters that were critical for upcoming training exercises. The work was demanding, requiring her to crawl into tight spaces and work with heavy machinery for hours at a time. Colonel James Hartwell had been the base commander for only 6 months, having transferred from a desk job in Washington. Unlike his predecessor, who valued competence above all else, Hartwell seemed to have strong opinions about traditional gender roles in the military. He had made several comments during briefings that made Sarah and other female personnel uncomfortable, though nothing actionable enough to file a formal complaint. As Sarah worked beneath the belly of a Chinook helicopter, carefully inspecting hydraulic lines, she heard heavy footsteps approaching across the hangar floor. The sound echoed ominously in the cavernous space, and something about the deliberate pace made her look up from her work. Colonel Hartwell stood there, his face flushed with anger, holding a maintenance report in his clenched fist. The report detailed a minor discrepancy Sarah had noted in one of the helicopters the previous week. Following proper protocol, she had grounded the aircraft until repairs could be completed. It was a routine decision that any responsible mechanic would make, but apparently, it had disrupted some training schedule that Hartwell considered important. Without warning or explanation, Hartwell reached down and grabbed Sarah by her ponytail, yanking her roughly to her feet. The sudden violence of the action sent shock waves through her body, and she stumbled backward, her tools clattering to the concrete floor. The colonel's grip was painful, and she could feel individual strands of her hair being pulled from her scalp. The hangar fell completely silent. Every mechanic, every technician, every person within sight stopped what they were doing. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and Sarah's sharp intake of breath as she processed what had just happened. Time seemed suspended in that moment, as if the entire world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Sarah's mind raced through 1,000 thoughts in the span of seconds. She thought about her career, her family's pride in her service, the years of hard work that had brought her to this point. She thought about every woman who had fought for the right to serve alongside men, about the responsibility she carried as a representative of her gender in this environment. But mostly, she thought about dignity, respect, and the oath she had taken to serve with honor. As Colonel Hartwell maintained his grip on her hair, his eyes boring into hers with what seemed like a mixture of anger and contempt, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. The entire base was about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come, something that would challenge every assumption about power, authority, and what it truly means to serve one's country with honor. Instead of reacting with the anger or fear that Colonel Hartwell might have expected, Sarah did something completely unexpected. She looked him directly in the eyes, her expression calm and composed despite the painful grip he maintained on her hair. In a clear, steady voice that carried across the silent hangar, she spoke words that would echo through the base for months to come. "Sir, I need you to release me immediately so we can discuss this situation properly and professionally." Her tone was neither defiant nor submissive, but rather carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly what was right and wrong in that moment. The contrast between his violent action and her measured response created a tension that everyone present could feel. Hartwell seemed momentarily stunned by her composure. He had clearly expected her to cower or cry, perhaps to apologize frantically for whatever perceived slight had triggered his outburst. Instead, he found himself face to face with a woman who refused to be intimidated, whose professionalism shone through even in this moment of physical assault. The other personnel in the hangar began to move closer, though they maintained a respectful distance. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, Sarah's immediate supervisor and a 20-year veteran, stepped forward with his hands slightly raised in a peacekeeping gesture. Technical specialist Lisa Chen discreetly pulled out her phone, understanding instinctively that this moment needed to be documented. "Colonel, perhaps we should take this conversation to your office," Rodriguez suggested carefully, his voice betraying none of the outrage he felt. He had worked with Sarah for 3 years and knew her to be one of the most dedicated and competent mechanics he had ever supervised. Seeing her treated this way made his blood boil. But military protocol demanded careful handling of the situation. Sarah remained perfectly still, neither pulling away nor submitting to the humiliation that Hartwell seemed intent on inflicting. Her breathing was controlled, her posture straight despite the awkward angle her head was forced into by his grip. She had trained for combat situations, learned to remain calm under pressure, but nothing in her military education had prepared her for being physically assaulted by her commanding officer. Around them, the normal sounds of the hangar had completely stopped. Wrenchwork ceased, conversations died. Even the radio chatter seemed to fade into background noise. Every person present understood they were witnessing something significant, a moment that would define not just Sarah's career, but potentially the culture of the entire base. Hartwell's grip began to loosen slightly, perhaps as he realized the number of witnesses to his actions. But Sarah wasn't finished. In the same calm professional tone, she continued speaking, her words chosen carefully but delivered with unmistakable authority. "Sir, as a member of the United States military, I have certain rights that are protected under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. What you're doing right now constitutes assault, and I'm going to need you to explain your actions through proper channels." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the assembled crowd. "I'm also going to need medical documentation of this incident, and I'll be filing a formal report with the Inspector General's office." The transformation in the hangar was immediate and palpable. What had begun as a moment of potential humiliation for Sarah had somehow shifted into something entirely different. Her calm professionalism in the face of physical assault had exposed Hartwell's behavior for what it was, stripping away any pretense of justified authority and revealing it as simple abuse of power. Other female personnel on the base, who had been watching from various positions around the hangar, began to move closer. They formed a loose circle around Sarah and the colonel, not threatening but clearly present, clearly witnessing. Their solidarity was silent but unmistakable, and Hartwell found himself surrounded by the very people he had sought to intimidate. The colonel's face had gone from flushed with anger to pale, with what might have been the first dawning recognition of the consequences of his actions. Still, he maintained his grip on Sarah's hair, as if releasing her would somehow admit wrongdoing. The standoff continued with tension building by the second, until something happened that no one expected. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the tense silence that had enveloped the hangar. Through the open bay doors, everyone could see a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the building, their government license plates clearly visible even from a distance. What none of them knew was that Inspector General Colonel Patricia Williams had been conducting a scheduled inspection of base operations and had received an anonymous tip about irregularities in the maintenance division. Colonel Williams stepped out of the lead vehicle, accompanied by her team of investigators. She was a formidable woman in her 50s, known throughout the military for her unwavering commitment to justice and her zero-tolerance policy for any form of abuse or misconduct. Her reputation preceded her wherever she went, and commanding officers typically spent weeks preparing for her visits. As the IG team entered the hangar, their trained eyes immediately assessed the situation before them. Colonel Hartwell still maintained his grip on Sarah's hair, though his hold had loosened considerably as he noticed the approaching investigators. The circle of personnel around them, the phones that were now openly recording, and the obvious tension in the air told its own story without any words being spoken. Sarah saw the approaching team and made a decision that would later be studied in military leadership courses. Rather than wait to be rescued or allow the situation to be swept under bureaucratic carpets, she took control of her own narrative. Speaking clearly enough for the investigators to hear, she addressed Colonel Hartwell one final time. "Sir, I'm going to count to 3, and then I'm going to remove your hand from my hair and file charges. 1. Her voice carried across the hangar with crystal clarity, each word precisely enunciated. The countdown wasn't just for Hartwell, it was for every witness present, giving them a clear timeline of events that could never be disputed later. 2. By this point, Colonel Williams and her team had approached close enough to see exactly what was happening. The IG Colonel's expression was unreadable, but her investigators were already taking notes and photographs. This was clearly not the routine maintenance inspection they had planned for. Hartwell's grip loosened further, but he seemed frozen by indecision, and perhaps by the growing realization of how many career-ending mistakes he had made in the span of just a few minutes. His breathing became labored, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the hangar. 3. Sarah calmly reached up and removed Hartwell's hand from her hair, her movements deliberate and controlled. She then stepped back 2 paces, smoothed down her ponytail, and turned to face Colonel Williams and her team. Her posture was perfect, her expression professional, and her voice steady as she rendered a crisp salute. "Ma'am, Specialist Sarah Martinez reporting an incident of physical assault by my commanding officer, Colonel James Hartwell. I have multiple witnesses and request immediate medical evaluation and documentation of this assault." Her words were delivered with the precision of someone who had thought through exactly how this moment should unfold. The transformation in the hangar was immediate and dramatic. What had been a tense standoff between a subordinate and her commanding officer had suddenly become a formal military investigation with the highest levels of oversight present. Hartwell found himself facing not just an angry mechanic, but a trained investigative team whose job it was to root out exactly this type of misconduct. Colonel Williams nodded to her team, who immediately began documenting the scene and taking statements from witnesses. She approached Sarah with a combination of professional concern and obvious respect for how the young woman had handled an impossible situation. "Specialist Martinez, you'll receive immediate medical attention and will need your full statement. I want you to know that you've handled this situation with exceptional professionalism under extremely difficult circumstances." She then turned to Hartwell, her expression hardening noticeably. "Colonel Hartwell, you're hereby relieved of duty pending a full investigation into this incident." The words hit Hartwell like a physical blow. In the span of less than 10 minutes, he had gone from base commander to relieved of duty, facing potential court-martial and the end of a 20-year military career. The silence in the hangar was deafening as the reality of the situation sank in for everyone present. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. What she did next would ensure that this incident became more than just a single case of justice being served. As Colonel Williams and her team began their formal investigation, Sarah made a request that surprised everyone present. Instead of focusing solely on her own assault, she asked to speak privately with the Inspector General about broader issues affecting female personnel on the base. This wasn't about revenge or personal vindication, she explained, but about ensuring that no other woman would face the kind of treatment she had just experienced. The private conversation took place in a secure office adjacent to the hangar, where Sarah presented a detailed account of months of subtle harassment, discriminatory comments, and policy changes that had made life increasingly difficult for female personnel under Hartwell's command. She had documented everything meticulously, not because she had planned for this moment, but because her engineering background had taught her the value of keeping accurate records. Sarah pulled out a small notebook she always carried, filled with dates, times, and exact quotes from Hartwell's various interactions with female staff. There were comments about women being naturally unsuited for certain roles, policy changes that seemed designed to make female personnel's jobs more difficult, and a pattern of behavior that suggested today's assault was an escalation rather than an isolated incident. "Ma'am, this isn't just about what happened to me today," Sarah explained to Colonel Williams. "There are 12 other women on this base who have been dealing with increasingly hostile treatment. Some have been considering transfer requests just to escape the environment here. I believe Colonel Hartwell's actions today were the result of a mindset that has been growing worse over time." Colonel Williams listened intently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. As an experienced investigator, she recognized the signs of a systemic problem rather than a single bad actor. Sarah's documentation was thorough and credible, painting a picture of a commanding officer who had gradually become more emboldened in his discriminatory behavior. Meanwhile, back in the hangar, word of the incident was spreading throughout the base with unprecedented speed. In the age of smartphones and social media, Multiple videos of the confrontation had already been recorded from different angles. The footage showed clearly what had happened, but more importantly, it captured Sarah's composed and professional response to an impossible situation. The base personnel were reacting with a mixture of outrage, admiration, and disbelief. Many had suspected that Hartwell's attitudes toward female personnel were problematic, but few had imagined he would resort to physical assault. The fact that Sarah had handled the situation with such grace and professionalism, while simultaneously ensuring that justice would be served, had earned her immediate respect from colleagues who might not have known her well. Before technical specialist Lisa Chen, who had recorded much of the incident, found herself surrounded by other personnel wanting to know what they could do to support Sarah and ensure that the investigation proceeded properly. Sergeant Rodriguez was already organizing witness statements and gathering documentation that might be relevant to the broader investigation, but perhaps the most significant reaction came from the 12 female personnel that Sarah had mentioned to Colonel Williams. As news of her stand spread, they began coming forward with their own experiences and documentation of Hartwell's behavior. What had started as one woman's refusal to be victimized was rapidly becoming a collective action that would reshape the entire culture of the base. Captain Jennifer Hayes, a logistics officer who had been considering a transfer to escape Hartwell's increasingly hostile environment, decided to cancel her transfer request and instead provide her own testimony to the investigation. Lieutenant Maria Santos, who had endured months of belittling comments about her capabilities, finally felt safe enough to speak up about her experiences. The investigation was expanding beyond what anyone had initially imagined, but Sarah wasn't content to simply let others take control of the process. She had one more surprise that would ensure this incident had lasting impact far beyond Fort Davidson. That evening, Sarah sat down at her computer and began drafting a letter. But this wasn't a complaint or a request for further action. Instead, she was writing a detailed proposal for policy changes that could prevent similar incidents from occurring at bases throughout the military. Her engineering mind had identified the systemic weaknesses that had allowed Hartwell's behavior to escalate, and she had solutions. The letter outlined specific training requirements for commanding officers, clear reporting procedures for discrimination and harassment, and accountability measures that would make it much more difficult for problem officers to continue their careers unchecked. It was a comprehensive document that demonstrated not just her personal courage, but her commitment to improving the military for everyone who would serve after her. 3 weeks after the incident in the hangar, the transformation at Fort Davidson was remarkable. Sarah had become something she never expected to be, a symbol of courage and professionalism that extended far beyond the boundaries of the base. Her detailed policy proposal had been forwarded not just to base leadership, but to Pentagon officials who were already dealing with mounting pressure to address gender-related issues in the military. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of behavior that was even worse than initially suspected. Hartwell had not only created a hostile environment for female personnel, but had also retaliated against male personnel who had tried to support their female colleagues. His relief from duty had been made permanent, and he was facing court-martial proceedings that would likely end his military career and possibly result in criminal charges. But Sarah's impact went beyond bringing one bad officer to justice. Her composed response to assault had been viewed millions of times on social media, with military personnel from around the world commenting on her professionalism and courage. Military leadership schools began using the incident as a case study in proper response to abuse of authority, though they were careful to note that her approach required exceptional courage and might not be suitable for every situation. The 12 female personnel who had come forward during the investigation had formed an informal support network that was helping other women throughout the base. They had organized training sessions on recognizing harassment, proper reporting procedures, and legal rights that all military personnel should know. What had started as a response to one incident had become a movement for positive change. Sarah found herself in an unexpected position. She was receiving requests for interviews from military publications and being invited to speak at conferences about leadership and equality in the armed forces. While she appreciated the recognition, she remained focused on her primary job as a mechanic and her commitment to improving conditions for all military personnel. The most significant change came in the form of new base policies that directly implemented many of Sarah's suggestions. Commanding officers now received mandatory training on equal treatment and proper conduct, with regular assessments and clear consequences for violations. A new reporting system had been established that allowed personnel to report concerns without fear of retaliation, with investigations handled by independent teams rather than the chain of command. Colonel Williams, who had overseen the investigation, had been so impressed with Sarah's documentation and policy proposals that she recommended her for accelerated promotion and offered her a position with the Inspector General's office. The offer would have meant a significant career advancement and the opportunity to work on systemic improvements throughout the military. Sarah spent long hours considering the offer. It represented everything she had worked toward: recognition for her abilities, the chance to make a real difference, and advancement beyond what she had ever imagined possible. Her family was proud of her courage and encouraged her to take advantage of the opportunities that were opening up as a result of her actions. But as she walked through the hangar where everything had started, watching her colleagues work on the aircraft that kept the base operational, Sarah realized that her answer had been clear from the beginning. She loved her work as a mechanic, loved solving complex problems and keeping aircraft flying safely. While she was honored by the recognition and the opportunities it had created, she knew where she belonged. Her decision surprised many people, but it was entirely consistent with the character she had displayed throughout the crisis. Sarah Martinez wasn't interested in personal advancement or fame. She was interested in doing her job well, treating people with respect, and ensuring that others could do the same without fear of harassment or abuse. When she announced her decision to remain at Fort Davidson as a mechanic, the response from her colleagues was overwhelmingly positive. They understood that her choice represented the same values that had guided her response to Hartwell's assault: commitment to duty, loyalty to her team, and focus on the mission rather than personal gain. But even as she returned to her routine work, Sarah knew that her life had changed permanently. She had become a role model for military personnel everywhere, proof that one person's courage and professionalism could create positive change that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. The challenge now was living up to that example while remaining true to the person she had always been. 6 months later, Fort Davidson had become a model for military bases throughout the country. The policies that Sarah had proposed and that had been implemented following the investigation were being adopted by bases across all service branches. Her name had become synonymous with courage under pressure and principled leadership, though she remained remarkably humble about the attention her actions had generated. The hangar where the incident occurred had taken on an almost legendary status among base personnel. New arrivals were often told the story of what had happened there, not as gossip or entertainment, but as an example of the standards of professionalism and mutual respect that were expected at Fort Davidson. The culture of the base had fundamentally changed, with personnel at all levels demonstrating increased awareness of proper conduct and support for their colleagues. Sarah's daily routine remained largely unchanged. She still arrived before dawn, still worked methodically through her maintenance schedules, and still took pride in keeping aircraft operational and safe. But now her work took place in an environment where all personnel, regardless of gender, could focus on their duties without fear of harassment or discrimination. The legal proceedings against Hartwell had concluded with his conviction on multiple charges including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and creating a hostile work environment. He had been sentenced to military prison and discharged from service, effectively ending a career that had once seemed promising. The case had become a landmark in military justice, establishing important precedents for how such incidents would be handled in the future. Perhaps more importantly, the incident had sparked broader conversations about leadership, accountability, and the responsibility that all military personnel have to maintain standards of conduct that reflect the values of their service. Sarah had received letters from military personnel around the world, thanking her for her courage and describing how her example had inspired them to address problems in their own units. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A group of female cadets at the military academy had written to thank her for demonstrating that it was possible to stand up for what was right while maintaining the highest standards of military professionalism. They had organized a scholarship fund in her name to support women pursuing careers in military technical fields. ensuring that her impact would continue for generations. Sarah had also received recognition from civilian organizations dedicated to workplace equality and women's rights. While she appreciated their support, she was careful to emphasize that her actions had been about military values rather than any broader social agenda. She believed strongly that the military should be a place where all qualified personnel could serve effectively, regardless of their background or characteristics. The transformation at Fort Davidson extended beyond policies and procedures. The relationships between personnel had strengthened, with increased trust and communication at all levels. The incident had forced everyone to examine their own behavior and attitudes, leading to a more cohesive and effective team. Mission performance had actually improved as personnel could focus entirely on their duties rather than navigating a hostile work environment. Sarah's story had become part of military leadership training curricula, but always with the caveat that her approach required exceptional courage and should not be attempted without careful consideration of the risks involved. Military educators emphasized that there were multiple ways to address harassment and abuse, and that the most important thing was ensuring that problems were reported and addressed through appropriate channels. As Sarah reflected on everything that had happened, she felt satisfied that she had made the right choices at every step. The moment when Hartwell grabbed her hair had presented her with an impossible situation, but she had responded in a way that was true to her values and her training. The consequences had been far greater than she had anticipated, but they had all been positive. Standing in the same hangar where it all began, watching her colleagues work together as a professional team, Sarah Martinez knew that she had found her purpose. She was exactly where she belonged, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who shared her commitment to excellence and mutual respect. The incident that could have destroyed her career had instead transformed it into something greater than she had ever imagined, proving that courage and professionalism could triumph over abuse and create lasting positive change.